Ever since its early days, the Catholic Church has taken up the cause of good against evil, of heaven against hell. In the Middle Ages, this fight was waged with rather bloody means. Suspected witches were persecuted and burnt at the stake. Heretics were put on trial. In 1542, Pope Paul III initiated the Holy Inquisition, of which the sole purpose was to preserve the truth from any other beliefs, by all means necessary. The history of the censorship of Catholic literature was less bloodstained but just as intolerant. In 1559, Pope Paul IV published the first Index Librorum Prohibitorum, a list of banned books. Authors who challenged the Church's monopoly on belief were relegated to the Index. Those who read, owned or printed such books were threatened with excommunication. The Roman Index congregation targeted all new publications. As soon as a book was viewed with suspicion in Rome, the Pope's censors set themselves to work. Very few of them knew anything about literature. Millions of pages were filled by reports and files about supposedly dangerous books. The Pope had the last word.
Der Index ist entstanden als ein
The clergy in Rome realized that the invention of printing was helping the Reformation become a success. Suddenly, hundreds of thousands of pamphlets were spreading new ideas to the people. The role of the Index was to save them from the dangerous virus of the Reformation.
Dass sie sich mit dem protestantischen Virus anstecken. Und der Hauptansteckungsweg, das Hauptinfektionsmedium ist das Buch, denn dort sind alle gefährlichen Gedanken präsent.
Hubert Wolf is a priest and teaches the history of the Church at the University of Münster. For several years, he has been researching about the Roman Inquisition in the archives of the Vatican. Sifting through the Index, his aim is to find out the reason why some publications were banned and not others. Pope Benedict XVI is personally interested in this research. Before Cardinal Ratzinger became Pope, he was head of the Congregation of the Faith and used to be responsible for the censorship of books. Roughly 5,000 works have made the list in the past 4 centuries. Which books were suitable for reading by the congregation was decided for them. Freedom of the intellect was not much respected. Most important was to defend the Church's exclusive ownership of the truth with an iron fist. Censorship didn't only target theology, it also applied to sciences, medicine, and philosophy. Today, no one would mind people saying that murderers and thieves should be punished. Back then, keeping control of knowledge was just as natural. It was the uncontested duty of the church authorities. Criticism began with a new interest in understanding man and his rights. It really started with the assertion of human rights, as set out during the French Revolution.
Zu einem Verständnis des Menschen kommt und zu Menschenrechten, wie wir sie dann in der Französischen Revolution explizit erklärt haben.
The Church is against upheavals of any kind. Anyone who calls for a revolution quickly becomes the enemy of Catholic fundamentalists. A famous victim of their wrath was the poet Heinrich Heine. 10 of his works were banned because they were deemed revolutionary and against the Church. Even the pictures of his travels in the 1820s suffered this fate. In one of his books, Heine describes a hot summer's day and how he fled from the heat into a cathedral. The following words were indexed by the censorship expert. Catholicism is a good summer religion. It is good to rest in those cool prayers, in this cool cathedral. A holy dolce far niente. This quote is enough for the expert to decide no one should read the book, that it is religiously unsound. What is more, he's calling for a revolution.
Abgrundtief schlimm und außerdem ruft zur Revolution auf. Zack, muss verboten werden.
Heinrich Heine, Immanuel Kant, Jean-Paul Sartre. The Vatican fights against revolutionary thinking. Yet many of the books which were submitted to examination didn't end up in the index after all. Only recently has it become evident why. In his later books, Karl May developed a philosophy about a unified religion. He was never threatened by censors because they dismissed his books as too boring. No one would read them. They had long discussions over Hitler's Mein Kampf, and a large file remains as proof of this. However, Pope Pius XI eventually spoke in his favour. I assume that this may have resulted from the fact that Hitler was Reich Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933 and was therefore the head of state. The Catholic view on this is explained in Romans chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. All state authority comes from God. Those who rebel against the state also rebel against God. The last copy of the index was published by the Vatican in 1945, but the blacklist only ceased to exist under Pope Paul VI in the late 60s. From then on, everything can be read without endangering the soul. However, as a prime example of spiritual control, the index continues to cast its shadow to this day. The Church has to live with the accusation that it stood in the way, has to live with the accusation that it stood in the way, has to live with the accusation that it stood in the way, has to live with the accusation that it stood in the